The morning they threw me out, it was raining. Not the dramatic kind of rain you see in movies, not thunder, not lightning, not the kind of storm that feels like the universe is agreeing with your pain. Just a quiet, gray October drizzle that soaked through my good Sunday dress before the taxi even arrived. The kind of rain that doesn't care what's happening to you. The kind that just falls. I was 60 years old. I had 2 suitcases, a cardboard box, and $912 in my wallet. My son was standing on the porch behind me, and he hadn't said a word in 4 minutes. I know it was 4 minutes because I counted. My name is Dorothy Hargrove. Most people call me Dot. I'm 66 now, and I'm telling you this story from the master bedroom of my home, 11,500 square feet of colonial stone and glass sitting on 9 acres at the top of Cedarville Heights. From where I'm standing right now, I can see the entire town spread out below me. I can see the church where Harold and I got married. I can see the library where I spent every morning for 6 weeks using their free computers. And I can see, if I look slightly to the left, past the water tower, the modest gray colonial where my son Nathan lives with his wife Brittany. I look at it every morning, not out of bitterness, not anymore. I look at it to remember. Let me tell you about Harold first, because you can't understand any of what happened without understanding Harold. We were married for 35 years. He was the kind of man who remembered which flower you mentioned liking once at a garden party 3 years ago and showed up with it on a random Tuesday. He was also the kind of man who could not, under any circumstances, be trusted to manage his own finances, which is how I ended up running the books for Hargrove Construction for 22 years, while raising Nathan and occasionally reminding Harold that the electric bill was not, in fact, optional. We were happy. Not the pretend perfect kind of happy you see on Christmas cards. The real kind. The kind with arguments about whose turn it was to call the plumber and long Sunday mornings with bad coffee in the newspaper and absolutely nothing to prove to anyone. Then Harold got sick. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 3, diagnosed on a Tuesday in February. 14 months of fighting that looked like hope, and then like something harder than hope. He died on a Thursday in April, and the world just kept going. Birds still singing, neighbors still mowing their lawns, the mail still arriving every afternoon, as if something enormous hadn't just quietly ended. The life insurance was $68,000. Not nothing, but not enough to be comfortable for long. Nathan called 2 weeks after the funeral. "Mom, you should come stay with us, just until you figure things out." "I want to be honest with you." I hesitated. I had lived in my own home for 31 years. I had opinions about how kitchens should be organized and what time dinner should be served and whether children needed to say please and thank you. And the answer, in case you're wondering, is yes, always, without exception. I knew that moving into someone else's house meant moving into someone else's rules. But I also knew I was 60 years old and recently widowed, and that the house we'd built together felt less like home and more like a museum of everything I'd lost. So I packed what I could. I sold the rest. And I went to stay with my son. Nathan and Brittany's house was beautiful. 4 bedrooms, granite countertops, a backyard with a fire pit they'd used exactly twice. They'd bought it 2 years earlier with a mortgage that made me nervous when Nathan told me the number, but I didn't say anything because it wasn't my place. Brittany had decorated everything in shades of white and gray, and that particular shade of beige that interior design magazines were calling greige at the time, and that I was calling the color of a waiting room. I'm not being unfair. It was a lovely home. Cold, but lovely. Brittany was polite to me in the way that people are polite to someone they're tolerating. She smiled at the right moments. She asked the right questions. She said, "Of course, Dot," whenever I offered to help with something, and then reorganized whatever I'd done about 20 minutes after I'd done it. The children were 8 and 6, Lily and Cooper. Lily was serious and watchful, with Brittany's sharp features, and I would discover later, a great deal more of her father's conscience than her mother had bargained for. Cooper was all elbows and enthusiasm, the kind of boy who asks 17 questions before breakfast and means every single one of them. I loved them immediately and completely. I contributed my Social Security checks to the household every month. It wasn't much, $1,240, but it covered groceries and then some. I helped with school pickups. I made dinners 3 nights a week. I stayed out of arguments that weren't mine. I tried in every way I knew how to be useful without being a burden. Looking back, I think the problem was that Brittany had already decided what I was before I ever unpacked my suitcases. And once someone has made up their mind about you, there is almost nothing you can do to change it. Every dinner I cooked was interference. Every time I asked the children to say please, I was undermining her authority. Every suggestion, no matter how gently offered, no matter how clearly practical, was a criticism she hadn't asked for. I saw it building. I just didn't know what to do about it. It was a Tuesday in November, 8 weeks after I'd moved in. I remember I was standing at the kitchen counter making coffee. The good kind, the kind Harold had liked. Dark roast with just a little too much grounds so it came out thick and strong. The children had already left for school. The house was quiet. Nathan came in first. He was wearing his work clothes, but he hadn't put on his jacket yet, which meant he'd come downstairs early on purpose. He stood near the refrigerator and didn't quite look at me. Then Brittany came in. She was wearing a blazer over her pajama pants. I noticed that detail because it struck me as someone who had prepared for a performance. Her arms were crossed before she even stopped walking. "Dot," she said. "We need to talk." I set down my coffee mug. I looked at Nathan. He was studying the countertop like it contained the answers to questions he hadn't asked yet. "Of course," I said. "What's going on?" Brittany stepped forward. This was something she did. Physically moved into the center of a conversation, planted herself there, so that everything had to orbit around her. "This arrangement isn't working for us anymore. The children are confused about who's in charge. You have your ways of doing things, and they're very different from ours, and it's creating friction we don't have the bandwidth for right now." I waited for Nathan to say something. He didn't. "Nathan," I said carefully, "do you want to add anything?" He cleared his throat, looked up for a moment, looked back down. "Mom, I think Britt's right. It's a lot right now, with work and the mortgage and—" "So what are you saying?" I asked. I needed them to say it plainly. I wasn't going to help them soften it. Brittany said it plainly. "We think you need to find your own place. You're a grown woman, Dot. You'll figure it out." "And if I can't figure it out immediately?" I asked. "I have $912, Brittany. I don't have a job. I don't have—" "That's really not our department anymore." She said it the way you'd say something you'd rehearsed, cleanly, without hesitation. And I understood then that this conversation had been decided long before either of them walked into the kitchen this morning. I looked at my son, who I had raised alone from the time he was 7 because his father couldn't stay. My son, who I had driven to baseball practice every Tuesday and Thursday for 6 years. My son who used to crawl into bed with me during thunderstorms until he was 11 years old and make me promise that I'd always be right there. He didn't look up. 20 minutes, Brittany said. Not unkindly, just finally. 20 minutes is not very long to pack 60 years. I took what I could carry. Clothes, Harold's watch, a small album of photographs that I'd kept in the nightstand. The cardboard box from the closet shelf held the things I couldn't leave behind and couldn't explain to anyone. A birthday card Nathan had made me when he was 6 with the letters in crayon, uneven and enormous. A dried flower from our wedding, still faintly purple after all these years. A letter Harold wrote me on our 25th anniversary that I still haven't been able to reread all the way through. Nathan carried the suitcases to the porch without being asked. I'll give him that. He carried them out and set them down carefully, like the carefulness of the gesture could undo what the gesture meant. As I walked through the front hall for the last time, I glanced up the stairs. Lily was at the top. She was still in her pajamas. She must have come home early, or perhaps she'd never gone, I don't know. She was holding the railing with both hands, looking down at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not quite confusion. Something older than that. I wanted to go up and hug her. I didn't. I wasn't sure I was allowed to anymore. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," Nathan said from the porch. The taxi came in 4 minutes. I got in. I did not look back. Not because I was strong, but because I understood, somewhere very clearly, that if I looked back and saw the house and my son standing on the porch in his work shirt, I would fall apart in a way that I might not be able to reassemble. The driver didn't say anything. The rain was still falling. We pulled out of the driveway, and as we turned onto the main road, I caught one glimpse, just one, in the side mirror. Brittany was already closing the front door. The Sunrise Motel on Route 7 charged $38 a night. It smelled like industrial cleaner, and something underneath the industrial cleaner that the industrial cleaner was trying very hard to cover up. The carpet was a shade of brown that had probably started as something else. The air conditioning unit sounded, on its worst nights, like a large animal trying to escape through the wall. But the door locked, and the roof didn't leak. And those two things mattered more than I'd ever expected them to matter. Earl Boone was the evening desk clerk, 70 years old, former carpenter, with the kind of face that has been weathered into something almost sculptural. On my third day, without my asking, he handed me a different key. "Room 9 has a better window," he said. "Same price." That was all. He didn't ask me why I was there, didn't offer opinions, didn't pity me in any visible way. He just gave me a room with better light and went back to his crossword puzzle. I thought about Earl Boone a lot in the months that followed, about how a small kindness from a stranger felt in that moment more sustaining than anything I'd received from my own family. I filed it away somewhere important. I cried for 3 nights. Real crying, the kind that leaves you with a headache and a face that takes half a day to recover. Then on the 4th morning I woke up before the alarm, lay there for a moment looking at the water stain on the ceiling, and thought, crying doesn't pay the room rate. So I got up, I made bad coffee in the little machine on the dresser, and I walked to the Cedarville Public Library, which opened at 8:30 and had free Wi-Fi and free air conditioning and 12 computer terminals that were available on a first-come, first-served basis. I became first-come, first-served. I submitted 23 job applications in 6 weeks. 19 rejections came back, politely worded, professionally cold. 4 never responded at all. At 60 years old, with a resume that listed 22 years of bookkeeping for a small family construction business, I was not what anyone was picturing when they imagined their ideal candidate. I knew this. I was not naive about it. But I also knew something that the people sending those polite rejection emails didn't. I had kept a construction business solvent through 2 recessions, a period when Harold's health made him functionally absent for nearly 8 months, and a stretch in 2009 when we had 17 employees and a cash flow problem that would have made a lesser person pack up and go home. I knew how to solve problems. I just needed someone to give me a problem to solve. Ruth Calloway gave me that chance. Calloway's Garden Center was on the east end of town, a sprawling, slightly chaotic property that smelled like mulch and fertilizer and something green and alive underneath all of it. Ruth herself was about my age, with dirt permanently embedded under her fingernails and the kind of no-nonsense posture that comes from decades of manual work. She interviewed me at a potting table in the back of the greenhouse, surrounded by ficus trees and hanging baskets. She looked at my resume for about 30 seconds. "Why should I hire a 60-year-old bookkeeper part-time?" she asked. Not unkind, just direct. "Because in the 10 minutes I've been sitting in your office," I said, "I noticed that your inventory system hasn't been updated since at least 2009. You're paying above-market rates on at least 2 of your supplier contracts, and your seasonal pricing structure is leaving approximately 15% of potential revenue on the table. I can fix all 3 of those things." Ruth looked up from the resume. She looked at me for a long moment. 20 hours a week, she said. $15 an hour. You start Monday. My first paycheck was $240. I held it in both hands in the parking lot of the bank and thought about Harold, about the way he used to say that money was just a way of keeping score on work that mattered. I thought about $912 in a motel room and a son who hadn't called to check if I was all right. And then I deposited it and walked back to the motel and started looking for apartments. By month 3, I had moved into a studio apartment above Pete Gallagher's pizza place on Delaney Street. $680 a month, which left me approximately $50 after groceries and utilities. The apartment was small enough that I could touch both walls of the living room simultaneously if I stretched my arms out, which I know because I tried it once, alone on a Sunday afternoon when the smallness of my life felt most acute. But it had a window that faced east, which meant morning light. It had a little gas stove that actually worked. And Pete, who ran the pizza place downstairs with cheerful incompetence and a tremendous amount of heart, let me use the back parking lot for, as he put it, "Whatever you're doing with all those plants, Dot. I don't ask questions. You're a good tenant." The plants came in November. Ruth had mentioned, almost in passing, that the garden center cleared out unsold inventory at the end of every season. "All those plants that didn't sell by end of season. Straight to the dumpster," she said. "It's just how the business works." I asked her to show me. She took me to the holding area behind the main greenhouse. 22 trays of plants in varying stages of what looked, to the untrained eye, like death. Brown leaves, collapsed stems, soil so dry it had pulled away from the edges of the pots. "These are all going Thursday," Ruth said. I crouched down and looked more carefully. At the base of a pot that held what had been a hydrangea, I could see something, just at the soil line, just barely visible. A faint thread of green. "This one isn't dead," I said. "Dot, Ruth, look, right here," I pointed. "This is dormant. Not dead, dormant." I stood up and looked at the rest of the trays. "How many of these have you actually checked?" Ruth looked at me like I'd suggested we try selling the dumpster itself, but she let me take 4 truckloads home. The neighbors thought I had lost my mind. The woman downstairs, a retired schoolteacher named Dorothy Sims, who had an exceptionally low tolerance for moisture, knocked on her ceiling with a broom handle the first week because the drainage from my makeshift pots was seeping down. I bought trays. I apologized. I kept going. Every windowsill, every corner, every surface that could hold a pot. I checked out library books on plant dormancy and root systems and soil composition. I watched tutorial videos on the library computers every morning before work. I spent my evenings, after the bookkeeping work was done, after the dinner dishes were washed, crouching over brown and withered stems with a spray bottle and something that I can only describe as stubbornness. In January, nothing happened. In February, the first shoot appeared. A thin green, almost apologetically small stem pushing up from a pot of what had been a peace lily. I stared at it for a full minute before I allowed myself to believe it was real. By March, 160 of the 200 plants I'd brought home were not just alive, they were thriving. The apartment had transformed into something between a greenhouse and a jungle, and Pete had started telling customers downstairs that there was a woman upstairs who could apparently raise things from the dead, said with the admiring tone of someone who found this only slightly less impressive than a miracle. I called Ruth. "I have something to show you," I said. She came on a Saturday morning. I opened my apartment door and watched her face. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at the rows of healthy, flowering, fully recovered plants, filling every available surface of my tiny studio. "Dorothy Hargrove," she said finally, in a tone I would come to learn was her highest expression of astonishment. "What the hell?" I smiled. "I told you they weren't dead." She bought back every single plant at half the original retail price. In one transaction, on a Saturday morning in my tiny apartment above a pizza place, I made $1,180, more than my first month's salary. I sat on my bed after Ruth left, surrounded by the remaining plants, doing the math over and over on a yellow legal pad. Not because I didn't believe the numbers, but because something was beginning to take shape in my mind that I needed to see written down before I could let myself trust it. This wasn't just about plants. This was about a problem that nobody in the industry had bothered to solve. Ruth was losing thousands of dollars every year throwing away inventory that wasn't actually dead. If Ruth was doing it, other garden centers were doing it. All of them, across the state, across the country. How much money was being thrown in dumpsters every fall because nobody had stopped to look closely enough at what they were throwing away? I thought about what Brittany had said the morning she put me on the porch. That's really not our department anymore. I pulled out a fresh piece of paper. At the top, I wrote 3 words, second chance, scale, and then I made a list. Here is something Ruth told me later that I want to tell you now, because it matters to where this story goes. After that first Saturday, after she'd bought back every recovered plant and driven away with a truckload of things she'd written off as worthless, Ruth went home and called a woman she hadn't spoken to in over 30 years. His name was Bill Pearson. He'd been Harold's college roommate. He still lived in Burlington. And Ruth called him because she had recognized my last name from the moment I sat down at her potting table, and she needed to confirm what she suspected. Ruth Calloway had been 2 years behind Harold at Cedarville High School. They'd been in the same astronomy club. She had lost track of him over the decades, the way you lose track of people when life moves forward and geography intervenes. But she had never forgotten him, because Harold Hargrove had been the kind of person you don't forget. Generous, funny, absolutely certain that the people he loved were capable of more than they knew. She confirmed who I was. She hired me knowing exactly who I was. I didn't learn this until much later, but I think about it often, about the idea that Harold was still somehow looking out for me, that even after he was gone, his warmth had left traces in the world that I would stumble across when I needed them most. I think that's the truest thing I know about love. It doesn't end. It just changes shape. The small business development center on Birchwood Avenue did not look like the kind of place where empires began. It was a beige office in a beige building with a parking lot that needed resurfacing and a waiting room that smelled like old coffee and photocopier toner. The receptionist gave me a form to fill out. The form asked for my business name, my industry, and my projected annual revenue. I left the last one blank because the number I was thinking felt too large to write down in a government waiting room without feeling foolish. Sandra Watkins called me in at 2:15. She was 55 years old, trim and precise, with reading glasses pushed up on her head, and the kind of energy that made you want to sit up straight without being told to. She had been, I would learn later, the CFO of a regional manufacturing company until her husband's startup collapsed and took their savings with it, at which point she had quietly pivoted to helping other people not make the same mistakes. She had zero patience for vagueness and an almost supernatural ability to identify the exact moment a person was about to talk themselves out of something good. She looked at my file for 2 minutes. Then she looked at me. "Walk me through the numbers," she said. I walked her through the numbers. She listened without interrupting, which I respected. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, tapping a single finger on the edge of her desk. "You think you're in the plant rehabilitation business," she said. "I am in the plant rehabilitation business." "No," she leaned forward. "You're in the business of solving an inventory waste problem that an entire industry has accepted as unavoidable. That's a completely different conversation, Dot. And it's a significantly more valuable one." I looked at her. "The garden center retail market in the United States," Sandra continued, pulling up something on her computer, "generates roughly $48 billion annually. Industry estimates suggest that somewhere between 30 and 40% of live inventory is discarded at the end of each season. You do the math." I did the math. In my head, quickly, the way I'd always done it. The number that came out made me sit very still for a moment. "You're not saving plants," Sandra said quietly. "You're recovering an asset that an entire industry has written off, and you've developed a replicable process for doing it. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" "You're telling me to think bigger," I said. "I'm telling you that you've already built something bigger. You just haven't named it yet." She put a blank piece of paper on the desk between us and slid a pen across to me. "Write down the name of your company," she said. I picked up the pen. I held it over the paper for just a moment. Not because I didn't know, but because writing it down made it real in a way that everything up until that point hadn't quite been. Then I wrote, in my clearest handwriting, "Hargrove Recovery Group." Sandra looked at it, nodded once. "Now," she said, "we start." The SBA loan application was 52 pages long. Sandra and I spent 14 evenings working through it at her office on Birchwood, sometimes until 9 o'clock, sometimes later, the building empty around us except for the hum of the HVAC system and the occasional car passing on the street below. She brought terrible coffee in a thermos she'd had since approximately 1987, and I brought whatever I'd made for dinner and split it with her, and we worked through every page with the thoroughness of people who understood that the difference between a good business and a failed one often came down to a single number in the wrong column. I almost quit 3 times. The first time was on page 29, in the section requiring 5-year financial projections. The numbers I was being asked to project felt so far beyond anything I'd actually achieved that writing them felt less like planning and more like fiction. I put down my pen and told Sandra I wasn't sure I could do this. "You turned $50 worth of labor and $0 in materials into $1,180 in one transaction," Sandra said, not looking up from her own papers. "Pick the pen back up." The second time was when the bank requested additional documentation about my personal credit history, which included a period in 2009 when Harold's medical bills had pushed us to the edge of what we could manage. I was ashamed of it in a way that surprised me. I'd survived it, we'd recovered, but having to explain it to a stranger in a suit felt like being asked to justify something I'd already paid for twice. Sandra sat with me through that one quietly. When I was done, she said, "Every person who ever built anything real has a 2009 in their file somewhere. It doesn't disqualify you. It just means you know what hard looks like." The third time I almost quit was on page 47, at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday, when I suddenly and clearly understood for the first time how much money $175,000 actually was. Not abstractly, really understood it. What it meant to be responsible for it. What it would mean if I was wrong about any part of this. What would happen to the small, fragile thing I'd spent 3 years building if the numbers didn't work out the way I believed they would? I sat back in my chair and looked at the ceiling and said, Sandra, what if I'm wrong? Sandra put down her coffee thermos. You were living in a motel with $912 3 years ago, she said. You found something that nobody else was looking for. You built something from nothing. And you're asking me what if you're wrong? She picked the thermos back up. Dot. What if you're right? I picked up the pen. Page 48, 49, 50, 51, 52. The loan interview was on a Thursday morning in March. Richard Bauer was the officer assigned to my application. 50 years old, gray suit, the kind of careful, neutral expression that loan officers cultivate the way some people cultivate orchids, with great deliberate effort. He had a yellow legal pad and a mechanical pencil, and he asked questions in a measured, unhurried way that made everything feel slightly more consequential than it probably was. He went through the application methodically. I answered everything directly. Then he looked up over his reading glasses and said, Mrs. Hargrove, you're 63 years old. This is a 7-year repayment structure. I have to ask, if your health situation changes, what's the contingency plan? I looked at him for a moment. Mr. Bauer, I said, 3 years ago I was living in a motel room with less than $1,000 to my name. Last year I turned approximately $50,000 worth of discarded inventory into $220,000 in revenue. I did that without a loan, without a facility, without employees, and without anyone's help except a woman named Ruth Calloway who let me take her dead plants home. I leaned forward slightly. My contingency plan is the same as my original plan. I work. I solve problems. I don't stop. Richard Bauer looked at me for a long moment. Then he wrote something on his yellow legal pad. He didn't show me what it was. The approval letter arrived on a Tuesday. $175,000. Sandra called me before I'd even finished reading it. Did you get it? I got it. There was a pause, and then Sandra Watkins, precise, composed, thermos-carrying Sandra Watkins, who had never once in 14 evenings of working together shown anything resembling sentimentality, made a sound that was unmistakably a laugh. Go build something, she said. I signed the papers in Sandra's office with my hands shaking slightly, which I tried to hide and didn't entirely succeed. Then I drove to the hardware store, bought a measuring tape and a legal pad, and spent the afternoon walking through every available commercial space on the east side of Cedarville. The warehouse on Merritt Road was 5,500 square feet with 14-foot ceilings, a loading dock, and a lease rate that, while not cheap, fit inside the financial model Sandra and I had built. The landlord, a quiet man named George Pryor, who seemed mildly bewildered by the enthusiasm with which I was measuring his floor space, shook my hand at the end of the walkthrough and said he'd have the lease ready by Friday. I stood in the middle of that empty warehouse, alone, with the measuring tape hanging from my hand, and looked at the space. Cold concrete floor, high windows with wire mesh, the smell of dust and old machinery. I thought about the studio apartment above Pete's Pizza Place, about the trays of brown, wilted plants lined up on every windowsill, about Earl Boone in the room with the better window and Ruth Calloway's face when she saw what I'd done. All right, Harold, I said out loud to the empty building. Let's see what we can do. I hired Jake Pruitt on a Thursday in April, 3 weeks before the warehouse officially opened. He was 21 years old and had been turned down for 17 jobs in the previous 6 months. I knew this because he told me, with the direct, slightly defiant honesty of someone who has decided that embarrassment is less efficient than transparency. He'd left community college after 1 semester, had a gap in his resume that he explained as, some personal stuff I'm not going to lie to you about, but I'm past it, and had applied for the Hargrove Recovery Group position because, as he put it, I don't know anything about running a business, but I know plants, and I know I'll show up every single day. He had come in for the interview carrying a small potted succulent that had clearly seen better days. Found this outside, he said, setting it on the table between us. Someone threw it out, but look. He turned the pot slightly and pointed to the base of the plant, where a faint thread of new growth was just beginning to emerge from the soil. It's not dead, it's just waiting. I looked at the plant. Then I looked at Jake Pruitt. Monday, I said, 8 o'clock. He showed up at 7:45. Hargrove Recovery Group opened officially on the 1st of May. The opening consisted of Jake and me standing in the warehouse at 8 in the morning, surrounded by the first delivery. 340 trays of end-of-season clearance inventory from 6 garden centers across 3 counties, with a clipboard, a processing system we'd designed on Sandra's whiteboard, and a playlist of Aretha Franklin that Jake had made, because, as he said, If we're doing something important, we should have the right soundtrack. He wasn't wrong. Francis Kimball showed up unannounced at 10 o'clock with a coffee urn and 24 donuts. Francis had been my closest friend for 11 years. We'd met in a book club at the library, back when I still lived with Harold, and she'd kept calling me every week without fail through the motel and the studio apartment and all of it, never asking for more than I wanted to give, but always making sure I knew she was there. She'd taken early retirement from her position managing a regional logistics company the previous year, and had spent the intervening months, by her own description, losing my mind with free time. She surveyed the warehouse, looked at the inventory, looked at my clipboard, looked at Jake, who was already elbow-deep in a tray of what had been ornamental grasses. "You need an operations manager," Francis said. "I can't afford an operations manager." "I'll work for equity," she said, "and the donuts are non-negotiable." That was how Francis Kimball became the second person at Hargrove Recovery Group. She turned out to be the best decision I made that year, which is saying something, because that year I also renegotiated 3 supplier contracts, developed the processing protocol that would become the foundation of our franchise model, and signed contracts with 18 garden centers across 4 states. I need to stop here and tell you something that I didn't know was happening while all of this was happening. 6 months after I moved into the apartment on Delaney Street, after the first batch of plants had come back to life, after I'd started to understand that I might actually be building something real, Nathan came to see me. It was a Tuesday evening. I heard the knock and opened the door, and there was my son, standing in the hallway of my apartment building above Pete's Pizza Place in a coat he'd had since before Lily was born, smelling faintly of the whiskey he'd clearly had enough of to come here, but not enough of to feel steady. He didn't say much for the first few minutes. He sat at my kitchen table and looked at the plants covering every surface and didn't comment on them, which I found interesting. Then he put his face in his hands and he cried. Not long, maybe 5 minutes, the kind of crying a man does when he's been holding something for so long that it finally just overflows. When he was done, he took a piece of legal pad paper from the notepad on my counter, and he wrote 3 pages. His handwriting was larger than usual, the way it gets when someone is writing through something rather than with it. He left without reading it back to me. He folded the pages, put them in an envelope from my desk drawer, and handed it to me. "I don't expect anything," he said at the door. "I just needed you to know." I read the letter after he left. Then I put it in the desk drawer and kept it there, through every apartment and every move and every new chapter, until the morning I carried it into the living room of Whitmore Estate and set it on the coffee table in front of my son and his wife. But I'm getting ahead of myself. By the end of year 2, Hargrove Recovery Group was operating in 9 states with 31 licensed operators and generating $1.8 million in annual revenue. I want to be honest with you about what that felt like, because I think people expect it to feel a certain way. Triumphant, perhaps, or vindicating. Or like the moment in a film when the music swells and the camera pulls back. It didn't feel like any of those things exactly. It felt like work. It felt like early mornings and late nights and decisions that kept me awake and problems I hadn't anticipated, and the specific grinding satisfaction of solving something difficult and then discovering something more difficult on the other side of it. It felt like being alive in a way I hadn't been in a long time. Jake had grown from a 21-year-old who showed up with a dying succulent into someone I trusted completely. He was running our Midwest operations by his 2nd year, with a precision and a genuine feeling for the work that I hadn't manufactured in him, only created the conditions for. Francis had built our operational infrastructure from what had essentially been a clipboard and a playlist into a system that could support a national franchise network. Gregory Holt, our business attorney, a careful, methodical man who had initially been mildly skeptical of the whole enterprise and had become one of its most enthusiastic advocates, told me during our 3rd quarterly review that I should think seriously about international expansion. "Canada at minimum," he said. "Probably the UK within 2 years. "One thing at a time, Gregory," I told him. But before international could happen, I needed to solve a more immediate problem. The apartment I'd been living in, I'd upgraded twice from Pete's studio, was no longer adequate for what my life had become. I needed space. A proper workspace. Room for the investment portfolio that Sandra had been helping me build, which required more than a filing cabinet and good intentions to manage properly. And if I was being completely honest with myself, I was ready for something that was entirely, unambiguously mine. Deborah Lane had been my real estate agent through both apartment upgrades, and she knew my tastes well enough to call me when something came up that she thought I should see. She called on a Wednesday in October. "Dot," she said, "Whitmore Estate just came on the market." I knew Whitmore Estate the way everyone in Cedarville knew Whitmore Estate. It sat at the top of Cedarville Heights, 11,500 square feet of colonial stone and glass on 9 acres of landscaped grounds. It had been privately owned for 40 years and had never, in my memory, had a for sale sign in front of it. "What's the asking price?" Deborah paused for just a moment. 4.8. "I'd like to see it," I said. Another pause. "Dot, are you sure?" "Deborah." "Right. Saturday work?" The estate was everything the photograph suggested, and more. Deborah walked me through in the bright October morning, the grand foyer with its limestone floors, the library with mahogany shelves running from floor to ceiling, the chef's kitchen that was larger than my first 2 apartments combined. The conservatory on the east side was essentially a greenhouse built into the architecture of the house, with glass walls and a climate system that could support year-round growing conditions. I stood in that conservatory for a long time. Then Deborah walked me upstairs to the master bedroom, and I understood. The window faced west and slightly south, and from it you could see the entire town of Cedarville spread out below, the church spire, the water tower, the grid of neighborhoods extending toward the edge of town. And there, slightly to the left, in a cluster of mature oaks and modest colonials, the gray house with the fire pit that had been used exactly twice. Nathan and Brittany's house. I could see it clearly from here. Every morning, from this window, if I owned this house. I turned away from the window. "Cash offer," I said. 4.1 million. Close in 10 days. Deborah's pen stopped moving. "Dot, the sellers are motivated. They've already relocated. They want a quick close." I looked at her. 4.1, 10 days. She looked at me for a moment with an expression that was trying to decide between professional caution and something that looked very much like admiration. "I'll make the call," she said. The sellers accepted in 5 hours. On a Tuesday evening in November, exactly 6 years, almost to the week, after a taxi had taken me away from my son's porch in the rain, I stood in the empty foyer of Whitmore Estate holding a set of keys that belonged to me. Frances had offered to come. I'd told her I wanted the first night alone. The moving truck was coming tomorrow. Tonight the house was empty. Just stone and glass and silence, and the particular quality of darkness in a house that has been waiting for someone to come home. I walked through each room without turning on the lights. My footsteps echoed off the limestone floors. In the library, I ran my hand along the mahogany shelves. In the conservatory, I stood for a while in the dark, looking out at the grounds. 9 acres that were mine, that no one could take from me, that I had earned with 6 years of work that had started with $912 and a room with a better window. Then I went to the master bedroom. I sat on the floor, the furniture wasn't here yet, with my back against the wall beneath the window. I took out my phone and looked at the photograph I'd kept through every apartment and every move and every hard morning when I needed to remember what I was working toward. Lily and Cooper, 6 and 8, standing in the kitchen of the gray colonial, flour on their faces from some baking project I'd been helping with, laughing at something just off camera, just laughing, the way children laugh, completely and without reservation. I looked at it for a long time. Then I put my phone away, leaned my head back against the wall, and said quietly to the empty room, "All right, now we begin." Outside, the lights of Cedarville glittered in the dark below. Somewhere in that grid of streets and houses, Nathan and Brittany were going about their evening, not yet knowing that the woman they'd put out with the trash 6 years ago was sitting in the most expensive house in the county. I wasn't angry. I was ready. 24 hours. That's how long it took. The real estate transfer ran in the Cedarville Gazette on Friday morning. Dorothy E. Hargrove, Whitmore Estate, Cedarville Heights. By Saturday at 9:43 a.m., the doorbell was ringing. I was in the kitchen, still figuring out which cabinet held the coffee mugs, when the two-tone chime echoed through the limestone foyer. I walked to the security panel near the doorway and looked at the screen. Nathan was wearing khaki pants and a navy polo shirt, and the expression of a man who has rehearsed what he's going to say many times and is no longer fully confident in any of the versions. His hair had gone gray at the temples in a way that made him look older than I'd expected. Or perhaps I simply hadn't let myself picture him aging, the way you don't, with people you've lost. Brittany stood beside him in a camel blazer and dark jeans, a handbag over one shoulder that I recognized as expensive from the shape of the hardware. Her posture was composed. her expression was calibrated. And behind them, standing slightly apart from each other the way teenagers stand when they've been told to come somewhere and have agreed to come but reserve the right to their own opinions about it, were two young people I barely recognized. Lily was 14 now. She had her mother's sharp, fine features, but something in the set of her jaw and the way her eyes moved. Careful, observant, taking everything in before committing to a reaction. That was pure Nathan. Pure, in fact, of a version of Nathan I remembered from before Brittany, from when he was young enough to still be the boy I'd raised. Cooper was 12 and had his grandfather's build beginning to show, broad in the shoulder, still a little unfinished, the way 12-year-old boys are unfinished, like a sentence that's getting somewhere interesting. He was looking up at the facade of the house with unconcealed amazement, his head tilted back at an angle that made him look, for just a moment, exactly like the 6-year-old who used to stare at the sky and ask me what clouds were made of. I set the dish towel on the counter. I took a breath. And then I walked, at my own pace, across the limestone foyer to the front door. I opened the door, but not the outer screen. "Well," I said. I let the words sit there for a moment. Let them look at me. At the cashmere sweater I'd chosen that morning in navy blue, at the house behind me, at the woman I had become in the years since they'd last seen me standing on a porch in the rain. "Nathan, Brittany," I looked at the two teenagers. "And these must be Lily and Cooper, all grown up." Nathan's voice, when it came, was slightly rougher than I remembered. "Mom, we read about the house in the Gazette. We wanted to come congratulate you." "How thoughtful," I said pleasantly. "Congratulations received. Is there anything else?" A beat of silence. Brittany stepped forward with the smile she used the way a painter uses a primer coat, to prepare a surface for something else. "Dot, we've had a lot of time to think about everything, and we know that the way things ended between us, the way we handled the situation 6 years ago, wasn't right. We've come a long way since then, and we really believe, that families should be able to work through things." "Work through things," I repeated. "We miss you," Nathan Sarr said, and his voice just then cracked at the edge of it in a way that I don't think he'd planned for. Then Cooper, without any artifice, without any calculation, just a 12-year-old doing what 12-year-olds do when they see something extraordinary, said, "Grandma, is that a real chandelier?" He was craning his neck to see past me into the foyer, where the crystal chandelier caught the morning light and threw small rainbows across the limestone floor. Despite everything, I felt the corner of my mouth move. "It is," I said. I unlatched the screen door. "Come in," I said. "All of you. We're going to have a real conversation." I led them through the foyer and into the living room. I had furnished it deliberately, not to impress exactly, but to reflect. The room said something about who I was now. The wing chairs in deep blue velvet, the Persian rug, the artwork I'd selected slowly and carefully over the past 2 years. Each piece chosen because it meant something rather than because it cost something. The floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the grounds, and beyond the grounds, over Cedarville spread out below in the clear morning light. I watched their faces as they came in. Brittany's eyes moved through the room with a rapid, precise assessment that she tried to make look like casual appreciation. Nathan looked at the windows. Cooper went straight to them, pressing close to the glass, looking down at the pool and the gardens below. "Mom, look at the pool," he said, turning around with an expression Harold used to get at buffets, overwhelmed by the abundance of good options. Lily didn't move toward anything. She stood near the doorway and looked at the room and then looked at me, and I had the strong impression that she was doing exactly what I was doing, trying to take the measure of a person she was meeting in some important sense for the first time. I gestured to the seating. "Sit down," I said. "Please." Nathan sat on the edge of the sofa like he was afraid to commit to it. Brittany sat beside him, straight-backed, the handbag on her lap. Cooper threw himself into an armchair with the physical abandon of the young. Lily sat carefully and watched. "Mom," Nathan began, "about what happened 6 years ago. Before we get to that," I said, "I want to ask the children something." I looked at Lily and Cooper. "Do either of you know why I haven't been part of your lives for the past 6 years? Lily glanced at her parents, then back at me. "Dad said you moved away, that you wanted a fresh start somewhere new." "I see," I said. "Did he mention where?" "He said you went south, to be near family." "I don't have family anywhere to the south," I said quietly. "I don't have siblings, I never have. Cooper looked directly at his father. The 12-year-old directness was absolute. "Dad, what is she talking about?" Nathan didn't answer. "Lily Cooper," I said, keeping my voice level and clear, because what I was about to tell them they deserved to hear without drama, without performance, just as plainly and honestly as it had happened. 6 years ago, your grandfather Harold died. I was 60 years old and newly widowed, and I needed somewhere to stay while I figured out the next part of my life. Your parents invited me to live with them. I lived here in Cedarville, in their house, for 8 weeks. "And then?" Lily asked. "And then one morning your mother told me that I was too set in my ways, and that it was time for me to find somewhere else to live. Your father packed my suitcases and put them on the front porch. I had $912. The room was very quiet. I went to the Sunrise Motel on Route 7, I continued. $38 a night. I stayed there for 6 weeks while I looked for work. Then I found a studio apartment above Pete Gallagher's pizza place on Delaney Street. I paid $680 a month and had approximately $50 left over for everything else." Cooper was staring at his father. "You said she went south." "We thought it was easier," Brittany began. "Easier for who?" Lily said. Her voice was controlled in the way of someone controlling it deliberately. "Dad, you told us she chose to leave. Those were almost your exact words. She chose to start over somewhere new. That's what you said." Nathan was looking at the floor. "I need you both to understand something," I said to the children. "And I want you to hear this clearly. I never stopped wanting to be part of your lives, not for a single day." It was Brittany who broke the silence that followed. She shifted forward and adopted the tone I recognized as her practical register, the one she used when sentiment was getting in the way of an agenda. "Dot, we're not here to relitigate history. Yes, we made mistakes. We've acknowledged that. But we're also in a difficult situation right now, and we thought, as family, that perhaps we could talk about moving forward together. Nathan's work situation has been challenging, and we've had some financial pressures, and you have, clearly," she glanced around the room, "the resources to help. We thought perhaps there was a way we could all benefit from—" "You'd like to move in," I said. She blinked. "Temporarily, just until things stabilize." "How long?" 6 months, perhaps a year at most." I looked at her steadily. Then I said, "I'd like to share something with you." I picked up my phone from the side table and opened it to a message I'd received the previous morning. From Patricia Norwood, a woman who worked in the county employment office and was a longtime friend of Francis Kimball. I held the screen so Nathan could read it. I watched his face. "Nathan," I said, "you weren't let go 3 months ago. You were terminated 6 months ago for falsifying expense reports." The color left his face in a way that was almost clinical to watch. "I also know," I continued, "that Brittany, you've opened 4 new lines of credit in the past 18 months. I know the house was refinanced in 2021 and again in 2023. I know you are not simply behind on the mortgage. You are facing foreclosure proceedings that were initiated last month." Brittany stood up. "How could you possibly—" "I have built a company," I said simply. "I have people I trust, and I have learned over the past 6 years to pay attention." I let the room settle for a moment. Then I said the thing I hadn't entirely planned to say. "I also know that you drove past the Sunrise Motel on Route 7, Nathan. Earl Boone, the desk clerk who gave me a room with a better window when I had nothing, mentioned it to me. He said a man in a dark blue Camry drove slowly past the motel most mornings. For months. He thought the man was checking on someone." Nathan's jaw tightened. He didn't deny it. "You knew where I was," I said quietly, "and you never stopped." The letter had been in the desk drawer of every home I'd lived in since the night Nathan brought it to me on Delaney Street. Now I stood up, walked to the writing desk near the window, took it out, and carried it back to where they were sitting. I set the envelope on the coffee table between us. Nathan looked at it the way a person looks at something they recognize and had hoped never to see again. 5 months after you put me out, I said, "you came to my apartment on a Tuesday evening. You sat at my kitchen table and you wrote me this." Brittany turned to look at her husband. "What is that?" she asked. Her voice had gone very quiet. I opened the envelope and took out 3 pages of yellow legal pad paper, covered in Nathan's handwriting. Uneven in places, the letters slightly large. "I won't read all of it," I said. "But there's a paragraph I think you both need to hear." I found it near the end of the 3rd page. "Mom, I know what I did was wrong. I've known it since the day it happened. The truth is that I was afraid. Afraid that if I tried to bring you back, everything else would fall apart. So I chose wrong. I chose to lose you instead, and I have been living with that every single day. I'm sorry. I don't know if sorry is enough. I don't think it is. But I need you to know that I have never once believed you deserved what happened to you. Not for a single minute. I folded the pages, put them back in the envelope. The room was absolutely silent. Lily was crying, quietly, steadily, the tears of someone processing something large and doing it honestly. Cooper had both feet flat on the floor now, watching his father with an expression I recognized. The specific look of a child who is revising something fundamental about a person he loves. Brittany's voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. You went to see her. Nathan didn't answer. You wrote her a letter and you never... 6 years, Nathan. You let me believe... All this time, you let me believe I was right. I was afraid, he said. Of me? He didn't answer that either, which was, I suppose, its own kind of answer. Lily spoke first. When she did, her voice had the particular clarity of someone who has done their thinking before opening her mouth. So this whole time, she said, you told us she left, but she didn't leave. You made her go. And then Dad knew where she was the whole time, and he wrote her a letter saying he was wrong, and he never told any of us. Not once, in 6 years. Lily, Nathan started. I'm not finished. She looked at him with steady, clear eyes. You told us she chose to leave. Those were your words. She chose to start over without us. And we believed you. Cooper and I believed you, because you were our dad. Cooper stood up from the armchair. He didn't make a speech. He didn't announce anything. He simply walked across the Persian rug and sat down on the sofa beside me, the way you sit down next to someone you're with, naturally, like it had always been the plan. That quiet gesture broke something open in the room that all of Brittany's sharp words and Nathan's careful explanations never could have. Brittany looked at her son. Something moved across her face. Not quite remorse yet, but the beginning of understanding that the ground had shifted beneath her in a way she couldn't quickly navigate back from. She turned to me. Fine, she said, and her voice had sharpened past its practiced warmth into something more honest. You want us to admit we were wrong. We were wrong. Are you satisfied? Is that what this is? You wanted us to come here so you could show us all of this and watch us feel it? Brittany, I said calmly, I didn't invite you here. You rang my doorbell. She had no answer for that. What I want, I continued, looking at Cooper beside me and Lily across the room with her clear, serious eyes, is to have a relationship with my grandchildren. The 6 years I missed with them are gone. I would very much like not to miss any more. And us? Nathan asked. His voice was very quiet. That, I said, is a longer conversation. And it begins with you telling these children the complete truth. Not your version of it. Not a softened version. Everything. Nathan looked at his daughter, at his son, at the letter on the coffee table. He nodded. Just once. But he meant it. Brittany left first. She picked up her handbag, said something brief about needing air, and walked out. The sound of her heels on the limestone echoed back to us, and then the front door opened and closed. Nathan stood slowly. He picked up the letter from the coffee table and held it, not reading it, just holding it, and then set it back down. Mom, he said, then stopped, started again. I don't have anything that's enough. No, I agreed. Not yet. He nodded, looked at his children. I'll be outside, he said quietly. Take whatever time you need. And then it was just the 3 of us. We talked for 2 hours. I answered every question they asked. About the motel, about the plants, about Ruth and Sandra and Jake and Francis and the warehouse on Merritt Road, and the 52-page loan application, and the morning I stood in an empty building and said, All right, Harold, let's see what we can do. I showed them photographs on my phone. The studio apartment buried in plants. The warehouse on opening day. Jake and me squinting in the morning sun. The signing of the first major contract. The day the Gazette ran a story about Hargrove Recovery Group that Sandra had framed and hung in the Birchwood office. Cooper asked about Jake specifically, studied the photograph from opening day for a long moment before he said anything. Grandma, he said slowly, this is Jake Pruitt. That's right. He runs our Midwest operations now. He coaches my soccer league on Saturday mornings, Cooper said. He talks about his boss sometimes. He says, Cooper paused and something shifted in his expression. He says she saved his life. I looked at the photograph. Jake Pruitt, 21 years old in that picture, holding a tray of dormant hydrangeas like it was something precious. He saved himself, I said. I just gave him somewhere to do it. Lily had come to stand beside her brother, looking at the photograph. That's what you do, she said. It wasn't quite a question. You find things that everyone else has given up on, and you give them a place to come back. I looked at my granddaughter, 14 years old, sharp and careful and honest in a way that made my chest ache with something that lived between grief and gratitude. That's what I do, I said. Before they left, I told them one more thing. There's something you should know about Brittany, I said. A few months ago, before the foreclosure proceedings began, when she was still trying to find a way to manage things on her own, an application came in to Hargrove Recovery Group for a franchise territory in Florida. Lily's eyes widened. Cooper went still. The applicant's name was Brittany Ann Hargrove, I said. She applied under her own name. I don't believe she knew it was my company. I've looked at her financial disclosures. She was trying to build something independent. She was trying to find a way forward. What did you do with it? Lily asked carefully. I put it in a pending file, I said. I didn't approve it. I didn't reject it. I waited. I looked at both of them. That application is going to be reviewed the same way every application is reviewed. On its merits, not on history, not on what I feel about your mother. That's more than fair, Lily said quietly. Fairness is what I didn't receive, I said. That doesn't mean I'm not going to give it. 1 month later, on a Saturday morning in December, the doorbell at Whitmore Estate rang at 9 o'clock. I had been expecting it. The butter had been out since 8 to soften. Harold's mother's mixing bowl, cream-colored ceramic with a small chip on the rim from some kitchen accident in 1987 that I'd always meant to repair, was sitting on the counter. The flour and the chocolate chips were measured and waiting. I opened the door. Lily was wearing a green coat. Cooper was wearing no coat whatsoever, despite it being a cold December morning, which I recognized immediately as a genetic inheritance from Harold, who had conducted a 35-year argument with appropriate winter clothing and lost every round. We took an Uber, Cooper announced. Lily paid. I'll pay you back, Lily said, already stepping inside. It smells amazing in here. Butter, I said. Come in. Take your coat off, Lily. Cooper, I know you don't have one. We'll address that separately. Cooper grinned at me. Harold's grin, wide and completely unrepentant, and followed his sister inside. We made the cookies together in the big kitchen with the morning light coming through the east windows. Cooper was constitutionally incapable of following the recipe in sequence. He wanted to add the chocolate chips first, before the dry ingredients, because the chocolate chips were clearly the most important part, and he didn't see why they should be made to wait. Lily read each step aloud from the index card I'd written it on, with the focused patience of someone accustomed to managing situations adjacent to Cooper. I stood between them at the island, flour on my hands, and I felt something I want to try to describe accurately because I think it matters. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't the clean, bright note of vindication I might once have imagined, the winning of something, the proving of something, the satisfying click of a door closing on a painful chapter. It was simpler than that. It was the feeling of being in the right place, in the right moment, doing the right thing, with the right people. It was the feeling of home. Cooper, the chips go in after the dry ingredients, Lily said. The chips are the whole point of this operation, Cooper replied. The chips don't work without the structure around them. Tell that to the chips. I took the bowl from Cooper, folded in the dry ingredients properly, then handed it back to him. Now the chips, I said. He added them with such satisfaction that Lily and I both laughed, and the sound of it filled the kitchen in a way that big kitchens are meant to be filled. When the first batch came out of the oven, Cooper bit into one before it had cooled and announced it was the greatest thing he'd ever eaten. Lily pointed out that he said this about everything. He maintained that this time he genuinely meant it. I poured coffee for myself and hot chocolate for them, and we sat at the kitchen table with the cookies cooling on the rack between us. They told me about school, about friends, about a history project Lily was working on, and the soccer tournament Cooper's team had just won, and the conversation moved the way good conversations move. without agenda, without effort, without anyone needing anything from it except the conversation itself. At one point, Lily asked, "Do you talk to Dad?" "We've spoken a few times," I said. "He's telling you the truth now?" "He's trying to," she said with the careful honesty of someone who loves a person and sees them clearly at the same time. "It's hard for him." "It should be," I said. "Hard things should be hard." She looked at me. "Do you think you'll forgive him eventually?" I thought about it honestly before I answered. "I think forgiveness is something that happens gradually, not all at once," I said. "Like plants coming back in spring. You don't see it happening, and then one day you look and there's something green." She nodded slowly, turning her mug in her hands. "What about Mom?" "Her application came off the pending list this week," I said. She said. "Sandra reviewed it. Francis reviewed it. Gregory reviewed it. I picked up a cookie. It's a viable territory, good market conditions, reasonable startup costs. And as it turns out, your mother understands retail and she's not afraid of hard work." I took a bite. "The approval goes out Monday." Lily stared at me. "You're giving her the franchise?" "I'm giving her the same thing I give everyone," I said. "A fair shot and a set of tools. What she builds with it is entirely up to her." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. "Harold would have liked that," Lily said softly, and it surprised me enough that I didn't speak for a moment. "Did you know him?" I asked. "Not really. I was 2 when he died, but Dad talks about him sometimes." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "He says Grandpa Harold used to say that the best thing you could do for someone was give them a real chance and then get out of the way." I looked at my granddaughter. "He did say that," I said. "He said it often. Francis came by at noon with a bottle of sparkling cider and a white envelope. Gregory called this morning," she said, setting both on the table. "The national contract finalized." Lily and Cooper looked at me, waiting for the reaction that a moment like that is supposed to produce. I picked up the envelope, turned it over in my hands, set it back down. "We'll open it later," I said. "Right now I have grandchildren to feed." Frances looked at me with the expression she reserved for moments when she thought I was being particularly and completely myself. Then she sat down, reached for a cookie, and said, "Is there more hot chocolate?" After Lily and Cooper had gone home in the late afternoon, Cooper negotiating all the way to the door about whether he could take 4 more cookies or was limited to 3. It was always going to be 4. I went to the library. The light was failing over Cedarville, the town going slowly gold and then gray in the December dusk. I sat in the wing chair by the window and opened the bottom drawer of the writing desk and took out the thing I kept there. A journal. Dark blue cover, cream-colored pages, purchased at a drugstore on Route 7 during my second week at the Sunrise Motel. The cover was worn at the corners now. The spine had been cracked and smoothed and cracked again. I turned to the first entry. The handwriting was mine, but seemed to belong to someone I only partially recognized. The letters, smaller than they are now, pressed harder into the page. The way writing looks when the hand is tight with something that hasn't yet been named. November. I don't know what comes next. I have $912 and a room at the Sunrise Motel, and I am 60 years old and I don't know what comes next. But I know this. I have been through harder things than this. I kept Harold's business alive through a recession. I raised Nathan alone when his father left. I have done hard things before. I will not disappear. I will not be thrown away. I turned to the last entry, written the night after the Whitmore estate purchase closed. Everything I have, I built. Every dollar, every relationship, every square foot of this house. I earned it. Not to prove anything to anyone in particular, just because this is what I do. This is what I have always done. Harold knew that. Earl Boone saw it. Ruth knew it, because Harold told her, years before I ever walked into her garden center. Tomorrow the grandchildren are coming to make cookies. I think that's enough. I think that's more than enough. I turned to the next blank page. I uncapped my pen. Outside, the last light had gone from the sky, and Cedarville below was a field of small, warm lights, each one a house, each one a life, each one a set of people doing the ordinary, extraordinary work of getting through and going on. I wrote 4 words. I am here now. I closed the journal. Sat for a moment with my hand resting on the cover, feeling the worn edges, the weight of it, everything inside it that had gotten me from there to here. Then I got up, went back to the kitchen, and started thinking about next Saturday. because Lily had mentioned she'd never learned how to make pie crust. And Cooper had declared, with absolute seriousness, cookie still in hand, that he considered this a gap in his education requiring immediate attention. I happened to agree.